this quarter, and I want to give us more than just a timeline of the important events that happened and dates when they happened. I want to talk, as we talk about this history, about the cultural developments that take us from the world that we leave at the end of the Old Testament in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and into the world that we step into in the New Testament in the gospel accounts, because those are two very different worlds. And the 400 years that intervene in history between those years see some very major cultural shifts and developments that lead from one world to the next and will help explain the world that Jesus lived in and that the church was born into, and how the gospel goes out into the world and spreads the way it does. So tonight I want to talk about one of those major cultural developments against the backdrop of what we talked about last time, which was the Persian period of the Old Testament, or the intertestamental period, which is not really, the Persian period overlaps the Old Testament, of course. The Persians overthrew the Babylonians during the book of Daniel, and everything that we read in Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi happens during the period of Persian domination. But there was a development that takes place in Jewish life that becomes very important in the life of Jesus, and that is the development of the synagogue. And so I want to talk about that for a moment tonight. When we think about the synagogue, I think it's important to look at the words that are used in connection with synagogues, because the word synagogue is not a Jewish word. It's not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word. Okay? And it derives from one of the Jewish words, or one of the Hebrew words. I say Jewish like it's a language. It's not. But one of the Hebrew words that was used to describe the synagogue. So let's look at our terminology here. The word synagogue itself comes from the Greek word synagoge, which simply means to gather together. It's a gathering place. It's a place of assembly. That is probably Greek for the first word that you see here on the screen of Hebrew terms, which is Beit Knesset, which means a house of assembly or a house of meeting. If you've studied Restoration history, one of the things you might have noticed is that some of the church buildings in the early part of the Restoration movement in the United States were referred to as meeting houses, because that's really all they are. It's just a place where the congregation comes together. And that was the idea behind the synagogue. It was a place where the people came together. We'll develop that idea just a little bit more later on. And then we have this second Hebrew word, which is Beit Tefillah, which is house of prayer. Okay? Beit or Beth is the Hebrew word house. And you'll see it in a lot of different connections. Some of you may recall a class that we did a while back where we talked about the term Beit Ab, the father's house, which was the hub of family life in Jewish culture. Well, that word Beit finds its application in a number of different things, like, for example, Bethel, place name, house of God; Bethlehem, house of bread. You see a number of places with Beth in the name, and generally that's just an anglicized version of this Hebrew word Beit, which means house. Okay? So you have a house of prayer, and then you have Beit Midrash, house of study. All right? Now I would argue that those three things tell us something about the view that the Jewish people had toward the purpose of the synagogue. One, of course, was it was a place for them to come together and to assemble. Now, when they assembled as what? They assembled as worshipers of God, right? Followers of God, as Jewish people, adherents to the law of Moses. And that falls right into the next two terms, Beit Tefillah, the house of prayer. They assembled there to pray. We're going to talk more about the importance of prayer in connection with the synagogue in a few minutes. And then a house of study. It was a place to come and spend time studying the Torah, in particular, the law of Moses. All right? And again, we'll develop that a little bit more in a moment. And then we have this Yiddish word. And I don't speak Yiddish, so my pronunciation will probably be terrible, but shul or something like that, which derives from the German word from which we get our word school. because it was a place of learning, both for adults, and we'll see as the synagogue developed, it came to become a place of learning for children. People would send their children to synagogue school, and they would learn there to read and write using primarily the law of Moses as their text, to learn to read and write. And so they would study in synagogue school many times up until about the age of 13. So it was a school as well as an assembly place. All right, now let's talk about where it comes from. When we begin to talk about the origin of the synagogue, we honestly don't know. If I were to stand here tonight and tell you the synagogue absolutely began in this place on this date and this, this occasion, I'd be lying to you because we don't know. There are a number of theories about where the synagogue originated and how it developed, and none of them are nailed down with 100% certainty. I think we can pinpoint one or two of them that seem to be the most likely, and we'll talk about that tonight. The first theory is that the synagogue may have originated as early as the 7th century before Christ during the reforms of Josiah. Now think about this. This is before the Babylonian attack on the city of Jerusalem, before the exile of 70 years, before the temple is destroyed. And if you'll recall, one of the things that was done during the reforms of Josiah was that the worship places that were dedicated to idol worship, that were referred to as the high places, those were torn down. And some have suggested that perhaps what Josiah and his followers did was to take those places and repurpose them as places to meet and study the law of Moses. And that may have been the earliest precursors of the synagogue. The only problem, of course, with that is we really don't have archaeological data to support it, nor do we have scriptural references that would definitively say, yes, this is what happened. That's kind of a reading into the scripture, something that might have been the thing that happened. It would not be uncommon in history when something like this happens for a foreign worship system being removed to have it transformed into a place of worship for the God that is replacing the idol. Does that make sense? That happens a lot, that those places are co-opted and turned into places of worship. Case in point, we'll talk about this later on in our studies as well. One of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes IV did when he came into Jerusalem and really upset the people was he went to the temple in Jerusalem and he set up an image to Zeus, and he started sacrificing to Zeus in the temple of God. He co-opted the place of worship and made it a place of worship for his gods. So that wouldn't be terribly uncommon in history. All right. Then we have the theory that it began in the 6th century BC during the Babylonian exile. I'll go ahead and tell you, I think this is probably the most likely theory. The idea being that when the Babylonian exile takes place, a number of important societal constructs have gone missing. First and foremost, the temple. The temple was the central location of the Jewish identity. And they weren't really known so much as Jews that early on. They came to be known as Jews during the captivity. But of Israelite identity, because it was the capital city, of course. But more importantly, it was the location of the temple, and it was the location of the center of the worship of God. Now, think about this. When the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, the tabernacle accompanied them wherever they went. And whenever they camped somewhere, they literally camped around the tabernacle. In fact, Moses had them organized by tribes and families and so on and so forth into a very regimented system of camping around the location of the tabernacle. So it was right in their midst. But when the time comes under Joshua that they conquer the land of Canaan and they begin to spread out and land grants are given and one thing and another, there has to be a central location for them to come and observe, especially the 3 main feast days during the year when they were all to assemble and take part. And that ends up during the reign of David becoming Jerusalem, and during the reign of Solomon becoming the temple. And so we see in the temple there are a number of things that take place. And the most important of those is the sacrificial ritual. And I say ritual singular as if there were one, but if you read the book of Leviticus, especially the first 7 or 8 chapters, you'll see that there are a number of purposes that sacrifices filled. I think for a long time I had sort of this mistaken idea that sacrifices under the law of Moses were intended to atone for sin, and that was pretty much what they were about. Well, some were, but the sacrificial system under the law of Moses also contained a number of offerings that were specifically designed not to deal with guilt for sin, but as offerings of devotion to God, offerings of thanksgiving to God, offerings of celebration of good things that God had done, and all of those sorts of things. So the worship system under the law of Moses revolved around the offering of sacrifices for a number of different reasons, and the altar on which those sacrifices were offered, in fact, the only altar on which they were authorized to be offered, was in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. Furthermore, that was the focus of the work of the priests, the Aaronic priestly system. And so you have them offering daily sacrifices every single day in the temple. On the Sabbath day sacrifices. The new moon sacrifices at the beginning of each month. And then you have the 3 large feasts that were observed there. You have the Passover and the days of unleavened bread that follow for the next 7 days after it. You have the harvest feast or the Pentecost feast when the barley harvest came in the early summer. Then you have the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles that follow one right after the other in the 7th month, which would be in the fall in our time, around about October, early part of November, as our calendar goes. And then you would have what I would call occasional sacrifices, and those would be things like offerings that were brought for sin. I'm bringing this offering specifically because I've sinned and I want to atone for it. So on this occasion, or I'm bringing a Thanksgiving offering because something has happened for which I want to offer thanks to God, and so I bring this on this particular occasion. All of that takes place in the temple. Well, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, and with it the altar, and all of the sacrificial work that the priests had been doing. There was no longer a place for them to do it. Now, the biggest reason that the prophets had given for God allowing the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple and allowing the people to go into exile was because they were unfaithful to the law of Moses. And the generation that went into Babylonian exile took that to heart. And they became very serious about learning and knowing the law of Moses, not just for the priests, but for the common everyday Jews. And so the Jews who come out of Babylonian exile are much more concerned on the individual level with learning and knowing and understanding and practicing the law of Moses than it seems that they really ever were after, say, the death of Joshua until the Babylonian exile in Jewish history before that. And the idea is that in Babylonian captivity, they no longer could do any of these things, but there were some things they could do. And because the Babylonians allowed them to live together instead of scattering them over the empire the way the Assyrians had done with the 10 tribes, they were able to meet together, and there were some things they could do. Number one, they could sing psalms. Remember, the book of Psalms is essentially the song book of Israel. And so they could sing psalms. They could offer prayers. Prayer became such an important part of Jewish life that it seems from the writings that we're able to go back and read, both from the ones that look back on the Babylonian captivity era and the ones that follow shortly after the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that the Jews almost viewed the idea of communal prayer as taking the place of animal sacrifices. That they do that because we can no longer sacrifice, therefore we offer up prayers instead. Not that the sacrifices wouldn't be required by the law if there were a place to sacrifice them, but just that sacrifice is impossible. We don't have a temple, therefore the best we can do is to offer up prayer. So prayer became very important, so much so that in certain sects of the Jewish faith today, there is an absolute belief that communal prayer is more effective than individual prayer. And there are certain ritual prayers that can only be offered if there are 10 or more Jewish men present together and they're offered as a group, as opposed to an individual offering those prayers. Okay? And then there's instruction in the law. During the period of the Babylonian captivity, we see the rise of the scribes. And the scribes are essentially people originally who were knowledgeable of the law because they copied it in order to preserve it. And they developed sort of a hierarchy of expertise in the law. And of course, the scribes provided the rabbis, those who would be teachers of the law. And so they would go to these meeting houses and they would teach the law to the people. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things we're going to see is that in Jewish tradition, it's not essential for a synagogue to have a rabbi, because any Jewish male can preside and lead in any of the synagogue worship activities, including reading and instructing from the Torah. We see that, for example, in the life of Jesus. Remember when Jesus occasionally would walk into a synagogue and he would read from the law, and then he would sit down and he would give instruction from the law? Well, Jesus didn't have any particular credentials. He didn't have the equivalent of a university degree in theology, and yet he could simply walk in Galilee, where he was known, and say, I want to read from the law and give instruction today, because he was a Jewish male. Okay? So you would see that sort of thing. And then it comes to be the center of the community and the society. Think about this. In the absence of the temple, you don't have that anymore. Something has to be sort of the center of gravity of Jewishness, for lack of a better way of putting it. And the synagogue sort of filled that vacuum. It was a place where people came together, and when people come together, not only do they perhaps worship together, but they also engage in social activities. Well, we do that right here, don't we? We come together on Wednesday night to study our Bibles together. How many of us will stick around after services and talk for 15, 20, 30 or more minutes? Not about necessarily the lesson that we studied, but what's going on in one another's lives. Or maybe we'll make plans to go out to eat together, or maybe we'll make plans to host a common meal here in the church building that has nothing whatsoever to do with worship per se, but because of our identity with the church, it becomes a hub of our social life as well as our religious life, and the synagogue was no different. And then, of course, children's education. As we said, the children came to be taught in the synagogue. And so the idea here is that in the Babylonian captivity, the synagogue comes to sort of fill the void that the temple had left when it was destroyed. And as the Jews dispersed out after the captivity, they took this idea of synagogue with them. Another theory is that it began in the Jerusalem temple courts after the temple was rebuilt following the Babylonian exile. Not a whole lot of archaeological support for that, obviously, because they weren't building synagogues in the temple courts. The idea would be that they met there and studied and then began to take that out into the local towns and cities and build synagogues. And then there's the idea that perhaps the synagogue began as late as the 3rd century in Egypt. That comes from a very interesting letter, or a couple of letters actually, that have been dug up in Egypt that use the Jewish terminology that comes to be associated with the synagogues, specifically the Beit Knesset, the house of meeting, in a way that seems to indicate that they were in the habit of regularly meeting in a worshipful sort of way. And so people have said, well, perhaps it began in Egypt. Maybe it began in Egypt, maybe it spread to Egypt by the 3rd century, we really don't know. We know that there were Jews in a population center there in Egypt as early as the time of Jeremiah, who had left, following the attack on Jerusalem, and had settled there. And there's a continuous settlement of Jews in Egypt for many, many years after that. And then finally, some have suggested during the Hasmonean period, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but there was a period of about 100 years where the Jews threw off the rule of the Greeks before they invited the Romans in to become their overlords, where they were more or less independent and they were ruled by a dynasty of a family known as the Hasmoneans, and some have suggested that the synagogue began that late. I don't think there's very good evidence for that. In fact, I think that we have some archaeological finds in and around Palestine that would predate the Hasmonean period that includes some synagogue ruins. So the best idea, in my opinion, would be that it began during the Babylonian exile, and it spread to what was known later on as the Jewish diaspora, the dispersion, those who were other places than Palestine, as a center of a place for the Jews in that location to come together and to worship and to fellowship with one another. So much so that by the time that Paul is making his missionary journeys, in most of the cities where he goes to preach, the first place he goes is to the Jewish synagogue, and he preaches there first. Okay? So we have this idea of the origins of the synagogue. And then I want to talk about the role of the synagogue in Jewish society, because it really cannot be overestimated both then and now. First and foremost, it was a place of prayer and reading the Torah. If you were to ask a Jew as far back as we have really any volume of writings about the synagogue, even up to the modern day Jews, what are the main emphases that take place in the synagogue? They would tell you it's prayer and reading the Torah. And those were the kind of the main purposes of having this place. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting characteristics of synagogues is there's not, for example, a particular architectural style that is common to synagogues throughout the world. If you visit synagogues throughout the world, you'll find that synagogues many times will mimic the architecture in the place and time where they were built. And so, for example, in China, Greg, I've seen some photos of some synagogues that look very Chinese, almost like some of the Chinese temples that you would expect from like a Taoist type of a situation. You will see, in fact, the title slide that I had a moment ago was of a synagogue ruins that's been found in Galilee, but it looks very Roman in its construction style. And you find that throughout the world, that they sort of adopted the architecture of the areas in which they were located because they weren't so concerned about that sort of thing as they were about prayer and reading the Torah. Yes?
The ones I've seen in Tennessee just got 20th century block architecture.
Yeah.
Like the one around the corner from my house on Campbell Street. Right.
Yeah, some of them are just very bland. American looking, so to speak. Yeah, and they sort of assimilated into the societies as much as they could wherever they were. You'll see some really magnificent synagogues in Europe if you ever travel in Europe. One of the reasons perhaps for that is there was a period of time in Europe where it was all but outlawed to be a Jew. And they had to have special permissions for almost everything that they did, and then those prohibitions were lifted, and they became more or less full citizens, and one of the first things they did was to build magnificent synagogues in the cities of Europe. So you'll find some really pretty ones there. But their emphasis, again, is on prayer and reading the Torah, and then as a place of instruction for the children up to about the age of 13. And they will often have very structured preschools and schools associated with the synagogue where the children are instructed, both academically, but more importantly from their point of view in the law of Moses. Now, when I say the law of Moses, let me say this. As time has gone on, of course, they have adopted the writings of rabbis down through the years, originally as explanations of the law of Moses, and then as commentary on the law of Moses, and then almost as, if not co-equal authoritatively, at least as a practical matter, almost as authoritative as the law of Moses. Okay? And so there's an awful lot of teaching of the Mishnah, the Midrashes, and such as that. And then you have a community center. In fact, you will find a functioning community center attached to a great many synagogues, especially in cities, bigger cities, because it is a hub of Jewish ethnic life. Now, y'all already know this, that I grew up in rural Alabama. And there weren't a whole lot of Jews around where I grew up. In fact, I was in my 30s when I met my first practicing Jew. It was in the city of Memphis. And it had never occurred to my simplistic mind that a person would identify as being Jewish and not also practice the Jewish religion. It just, that thought never occurred to me. And I was working part-time for a law firm while I was in law school, and 3 of the partners were Jewish. And I walked by the break room one day, and they had a bag of something they were passing around. The 3 Jewish partners were passing around the table. And I kind of saw it out of the corner of my eye, and I stopped and did a double take because it was a bag of pork rinds. And I stuck my head back in the door, and I said, "What are you eating?" And they said, "Pork rinds, you want some?" And I said, "Y'all can have those." And they sat me down and explained to me that they identified as Jewish ethnically, but not a one of them practiced the Jewish faith religiously. However, they would be frequently found at the local synagogue for all kinds of social events, because that was the center of the Jewish ethnic life there in Memphis, even though they didn't go to Sabbath day services. And they didn't pray to God. In fact, 2 of them were outright atheists. The other was agnostic. They didn't pray to God. They didn't really put much stock in religious side of Jewish life, but they identified as Jewish culturally. And so that was the center of the Jewish cultural life. Okay? And so much so that became the case probably by the time of Jesus. And then it was also, of course, a place of ritualized worship. The Jewish worship has come to be, in most of the divisions of the Jewish faith, quite ritualized. You have an outright liturgy that's followed in many of the synagogues, where you will have certain prayers that are offered at certain times, certain scriptures that are read on certain dates, and so on and so forth. Very much like if you've ever attended, for example, an Episcopalian church or a Catholic church or a Lutheran church where they go by a liturgy. The Jewish churches often also will go by a liturgy of their own. So it became a center of ritualized worship. Now, 2 or 3 things that the synagogue does not have and does not require. Number 1, it does not have an altar. There is no sacrifice that will take place in the synagogue. Even among, let's see, is it? I believe it's the Reformed Jews who will refer to their synagogue as a temple rather than as a synagogue. Still no altar and no priest. Why no priest? Any guesses?
Had to be of the tribe of Levi.
What's that?
Had to be of the tribe of Levi after 1870. We don't know who that is.
That's exactly it. Not only of the tribe of Levi, but of one specific family within the tribe of Levi, descended directly from Aaron through the male line, right? And the problem is, what archaeological or genealogical records were left behind after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 were utterly wiped out in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And there's really not any authoritative way for anybody this day and time to establish that they're descended in a direct male line from Aaron of the tribe of Levi, and therefore nobody can really take an authoritative claim to being a priest. Okay? So there are no priests, or at least there are no authoritatively recognized priests. Let's put it that way. By the way, do you know what the Hebrew word for priest is? It's Cohen. Have you ever met anyone with the last name Cohen? Especially from a Jewish background? There may be a reflection that at least somewhere along the way someone believed that they were of the priestly tribe. But interestingly enough, but there will not be an altar, there will not be a priest. There's not necessarily a rabbi, although most synagogues will have a rabbi. As we said before, any Jewish male is qualified to lead any part of the Sabbath day worship. Where does the rabbi come from? Well, this is an interesting thing about the synagogues. As a rule, synagogues are a democratic system of government. Depending on how strictly orthodox they are, the males or all the members of the synagogue will have a vote on the policy of each individual synagogue. Each synagogue is autonomous from each other synagogue, and they will hire a rabbi to come in and teach them from the law of Moses as someone who is schooled and expert in the law. And it's thought as being a help and an assistance to the local Jewish community to keep up their learning and education in the law of Moses, but not as being something that's absolutely essential to the practice of Judaism. Now, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? If we follow the model of the New Testament church, is it absolutely necessary to have a professional preacher in order for us to practice Christianity? No. Our congregations typically will take someone who has dedicated their lives to that work and provide their living so that they can provide teaching for the local congregation, but by no means is that something that's essential to the practice of Christianity in a congregation. As a matter of fact, the more you look at the pattern for the church, the more similarities you'll see for the organization of the synagogue in the first century. Synagogues typically would have a group of elders who were leaders, at least by way of wisdom and authority, if not having some sort of actual authority. They would have, of course, the members that would take part in the worship and things of that nature, and they would do all kinds of things for the community, just like the church did. So that's the development of the synagogue. As we go forward, we're going to find that it plays an increasingly important role in the development of the Jewish world that we meet when Jesus comes on the scene. Do you have questions or comments?
Just a quick question. If I'm talking to a Jewish person, there's so many verses that were in the Old Testament that really lock in with Christ. Would they accept, like if I'm reading from Isaiah, would they say, well, I'm not worried about that. That's not part of the book of Moses. Is that, how much would they accept scriptures other than the Torah itself?
That's a good question. And let me answer that by saying this. There are some folks who would identify as Christian who would say that the only thing that's really important are the words of Jesus in the Gospels. And, they would accept, for example, the letter to the Ephesians as being important, but not as authoritative as the words in red, so to speak, right? And by the same token, there are some Jews who would say the Torah, the first 5 books, are the authority, and everything else is sort of ancillary to that. There are others who would look at it and say, look, there are 3 divisions of authoritative writing. There's the law, the writings, and the prophets. And those are the authoritative word of God. And they would look at it that way. I think almost all Jews would view the Torah as sort of being preeminent over even the writings and the prophets, but there are a great many that would look at Isaiah as a prophet as being very, very authoritative. Does that answer your question? Good one. Any others? All right, thank you so much for your attention.